we've got Glen Vaudrey. And Glen, over to you for a little bit of a bio. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Hi. I'm an author of a few books, and this was the last one I had done, The Sea Serpent Carcasses, looking at all the remains of strange creatures washed up on Scotland's shores the last 1,000 years. Aside from that, I am an artist occasionally. I also run the Weird Weekend North conference, which takes place every April, and the Weird Weekend Film Festival, which is taking place this October.
And how do people get to come and see the film festival if they wanted to participate in watching?
If you want to come to the film festival, you can find details online at the Weird Weekend. Either look at Weird Weekend Facebook page, find me directly online, easy enough to find, or even the Weird Weekend website.
Okay, thank you very much. And this evening, we're going to be talking about the book that you've written, The Serpent Carcasses of Scotland.
Yeah, this book's from 2012, and it was a great interest in mine, sea serpents. It's all to do with cryptozoology. And cryptozoology, if anybody doesn't know, is a search for hidden animals. Now, traditionally, it's been flesh and blood creatures like mystery whales, strange monkeys in the jungle, 8 men in, say, the Yeti, that kind of thing. But one thing that I was always interested in was marine creatures. Because the sea is such a big and unexplored place, very scope to hide 30-foot-long mystery creatures. And growing up, it was always interesting because you can look out across the sea and, let's face it, you don't see anything at all. What could be hiding? And as I got more and more interested in cryptozoology, I started to get interested in the books. And one thing I noticed was lots and lots of reports of creatures. And it was a book by the cryptozoologist Bernard Heuvelmans called In the Wake of a Sea Serpent. And it lists a couple of 100 years of sightings. And as I was looking through that book, one thing became apparent: that nobody ever seemed to find any remains. And one thing that people always say about cryptozoology: if the creatures existed, why do we never find the remains?
Yeah.
For example, if we've got big cats running around the United Kingdom, how come we don't see big cat roadkill? We should see a puma knocked over on a busy road like we see most other creatures. So it got me thinking, surely some of these creatures must have washed up. We hear reports of whales washed up, so why not sea serpents? So I thought, as I'd been writing a few books on Scottish cryptozoology, I'd come across a couple of reports, and I thought, well, I'll do what nobody's done before. I will actually look at every single carcass that's been washed up and see just exactly what's there. And this token book was based on that research.
Thank you. So when you had a look at the carcasses that's been washed up, have you managed to, in essence, take part of that carcass and have it analysed for DNA, its structure?
There has been attempts to do DNA research on the Stronsay beast, or Stronsay Monster. The majority of carcass sightings, by the time they're recorded, be washed out back to sea.
Mm-hmm.
Without giving any spoilers away for the rest of the talk, you'll find out.
Look forward to hearing that. So apart from the serpent carcasses, have you been involved in any expeditions with being into zoology to look for these items apart from the one up in Scotland?
I've not gone looking. For the last few years, I've not particularly had the time to do anything. The sea serpent carcasses were interesting with. The other books have been more looking at a combination of folklore and cryptozoology. So I'm more interested in the stories. Certainly the books like The Mystery Annals of the Western Isles and Northern Isles, rather than looking for stuff let's be honest, a phantom black hound running across the Western Isles on a dark and stormy night, I don't think I'm going to find. But I have been out on a dark and stormy night, but not looking for a black dog running across. But there are creatures, or reports of creatures, or certainly folkloric creatures that appear at certain times. It'll be fair to say I've not seen them.
Yeah.
As
you're
for
right,
finding sorry.
You're right, though. Trying to find a black cat in the pitch black is not one of those things that's going to jump out on you very easily, is it?
No, and that's the thing. You can spend a great deal of time and effort looking for creatures. If you are based in the UK, again, it's no spoiler to know there's not a great deal in the UK. You are not going to find a mammoth. You are not going to find even lake monsters. There are said to be lake monsters in certain lochs. I was recently did a talk at the Weird Weekend on the Morag, the monster of Loch Morar. And as Scotland's second best known lake monster, the number of sightings could fit on the fingers of both hands. Very few sightings in a very large place. And one thing you notice, it is luck rather than effort. Unless you are supremely wealthy, you will not have the time to just sit and watch on the off chance. You can, as an amateur, spend a few days perhaps looking at something, but if it's the wrong time of year or the wrong conditions, the chances of you spotting something that nobody else has managed to spot in the last year is quite remote, shall we say.
So if people wanted to learn a little bit more about cryptozoology and involve themselves in projects that might be going on, where do you think would be the best place for them to start to have some kind of involvement?
With cryptozoology, if you've got an interest in any kind of nature, it's a start. And the thing is, cryptozoology covers such a vast array of things. If you to find the Centre for Fortean Zoology, again, that's a group that look at cryptozoology. That'd be a good starting point. But again, cryptozoology is such a wide thing. Like I say, my interest would be sea serpents, is other people's interest looking for, say, the pink-headed duck, an extinct duck, or thought to be extinct duck from northern India. And these people still go out looking for that. And it's strange because when you're looking for, say, a mystery bird, you're more ornithological. You're so far removed from the kind of Fortean or the cryptozoology. You're a bird spotter. If you're looking for that, nobody finds anything odd about that. If you say you're going to look for the pink-headed duck or the ivory-billed woodpecker, nobody thinks, oh, you're going looking for the equivalent of a mystery cat, or you're looking for the lake monster of Loch Ness. You're not judged the same because it's easy to understand. Most people do not understand which bird is rare or not rare if it walked past them.
No, probably not.
And if something's blown across the Atlantic and turns up in a bush nearby, 60 people turn up with cameras to take photos of this strange creature. But to the majority of people, no one had even noticed.
Yeah. So we lived in Yeovil for a period of time, and we arrived back home and there was about 30 people all stood underneath this tree at the end of our street, looking up with cameras and taking pictures. And my son was only about 11 at the time, and he was a keen photographer. And he said, I don't know what it is that they're photographing, but I'll get out there and take some pictures. And he did. And obviously, it's, as you described, a bird that had flown off course from where it normally would do. And obviously, it sparked a lot of interest. and he managed to get his photographs out first to the press because we lived right next to the tree. So that was quite interesting. But yeah, never, it wouldn't have noticed it on my radar at all. A bird's a bird's a bird. And I feel quite ignorant for admitting that, to be honest. But yeah, I completely understand that birds are more acceptable because they're things that we look out the window and we can see, and therefore we can verify that they are in existence. But the things that we're going to talk about this evening, and also other things that you've investigated, have no proof categorically yet, I believe.
It's fair to say there is very little physical proof. Again, you will find out during the talk my opinions on the sea serpents. There have been, for example, big cats found within the UK. There is a lynx, I believe, was run over. There are jungle cats have been found, again, hit by cars. So there are small mystery cats. Bigger things.
Do you think that might be because of the law that was passed, I believe, in the 70s about having wild animals as pets? Do you think that there is any truth to people releasing them into the wild because they couldn't afford to fall in line with the requirements that were made upon them?
I think there's a possibility, but there are other reasons as well that go before that. Jungle cats, one interesting theory that I'd heard of was in the days of sailing ships travelling from the UK around the empire, say going to India, the ship would set off and, say, halfway along its journey, the ship's cat would die, the rats would get all over the ship. As soon as he got to India, they'd grab the first available cats. Handful of jungle cats get picked up, thrown onto the boat, next stop, Liverpool. As soon as they turn up in Liverpool, they think, bugger this, we're off. These exotic cats then start to mingle with local populations. There's some evidence of certainly a mixture of cats along certain routes, certainly for jungle cats. There was one cat found in Staffordshire, but again, a little lady thought it was just a normal domestic cat and she was feeding every day. Then it turned out that was a jungle cat because there's not much difference between them. And it wasn't something that was run over. But you noticed it's different. As for lynx, I think one of the earliest lynx that were caught was probably over 100 years ago. And again, people are bringing them back. If you'd gone off to, say, Canada looking for gold or something, you were successful and you came back with your pet lynx. So people have had exotic pets for a lot longer. And I think people are just careless. They generally have been. Most animals don't like captivity and will do their best to escape. It was only last year that on the way back from work, I found 3 guinea fowl walking across a field that clearly had escaped somebody's enclosure. No idea, but they were making the best of it.
I live in the middle of nowhere, and I think the village has been plagued with sheep at the moment. I know that it's not quite the wild animals of Borneo that people would go on expeditions to find, but you're correct. If there's a space big enough for a head to fit through, they're going, aren't they?
They are, and there also seems to have been a tendency to release animals. If you look at the recent explosion in beaver numbers, the beaver was going to be reintroduced into a number of separate rivers that were going to be closely monitored. And before you know it, they're appearing in lots of different rivers. Some of them were hundreds of miles away from the release spot. The released beavers were still where they were supposed to be, So somebody had been dumping beavers around the country. The next, and it tends to be a certain pattern forming, but when they talk about the introduction or reintroduction of a creature, they start to appear. Now, some people like to think it's some kind of magical phenomena. If enough people want it to appear, it will appear. Well, there's no proof that there's some kind of secret organization looking at the latest releases, running around and dumping small critters. There have been more beavers released than officially and acknowledged in different places. The pine marten has made a recovery in strange places where it shouldn't have done. The latest creature that we're talking about is now the reintroduction of the lynx.
Okay.
And again, once you start this talk of in a few years' time, there's going to be a reintroduction of a creature, you will start to see it appear in advance. So it would not be a surprise to see that a number of lynx are being released. In fact, there was it earlier this year in Scotland, where 4 lynx had basically found themselves one day in a nice warm house and the next day thrown out at Aviemore in winter. So once it starts, people will take it upon their own abilities just to start dumping creatures. And again, they're easy enough to get hold of if they're small enough creatures. It'll be interesting to see when the talk of reintroducing the brown bear to Scotland, how many of those get turfed out the back of a transit.
It makes sense, because if I was somebody who was going to illegally dump an animal and I heard of a reintroduction, I personally would think, well, I'm going to go and put it there because it then has some kind of chance at reproducing and having another life and continuing that bloodline. So my mind would think that way. Do you think that's the reasoning behind it? Or do you think it could just be that they could get away with dumping an animal and nothing can come back because the release has been made public?
I think it is an attempt to actually rewild. So a proper attempt to rewild the countryside to either how it was 50 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago in case of some creatures. And it's literally, it seems a good idea. Let's do it. And again, it's easy enough to buy a lot of these things.
Yeah, I imagine it is.
They're not, in continental Europe, they're not as rare. There are people breeding these creatures, and there are a number of strange things that people have as pets to start off with. Again, as the cost of living increases, some of these creatures get an opportunity to run wild.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that long ago that there were still brown bears in captivity dancing for money on the streets. So, yeah, I can understand how, and particularly in Europe as well. So you don't really have the borders there with, walls that stop them from maneuvering through. So, yes, you could see how they could be released into the wild and make their way across the whole of Europe. But what's your thoughts on them being introduced back into Scotland?
I don't see any good reason why there couldn't be reintroductions into certainly some of the more wild areas. A lot of the supposed predators, there is enough livestock for them to eat, and I don't mean for cattle, just a sheer number of deer in the country. We have a vast amount of deer with no natural predators.
No.
Whether they're being introduced, bizarrely, the only problem being, while they may have all been killed out by hunting, reintroducing these creatures, is it fair to them? Because the landscape has changed beyond what it was. Certainly, you could argue in the north of Scotland there are certainly big enough estates to put these creatures there. But the weather has changed. The conditions have changed. The winters, the summers are no longer predictable as they once were. These creatures need certain conditions to live, the country may be overrun with deer. But if you're overrun with deer in the southeast and you're putting your predators in the northwest of Scotland,
Yeah.
you might have the numbers, you might have the food, be just 500-600 miles apart. And
then
this is the problem. It takes a lot more planning than I think a lot of people consider, and they're just some basic ideas. That's not really looking into it. That's just some things you notice. Yeah, the food might be one, might be an abundance of food, but it's in the wrong place.
and it could have further impact also with the knock-on ecologically. If they take out other smaller animals, would that have an environmental issue of overgrowth or undergrowth of another thing that's extinct?
Yeah, it has more problems. Part of the issue is where they have reintroduced creatures in Europe. You're talking about creatures that have died out recently. So, say the reintroduction of the lynx in certain parts of Europe, it may have only been extinct for, say, 40, 50 years, well within living memory.
Mm-hmm.
Even the most optimistic of research into, say, UK lynx looks at some records from the 18th century and interprets them as lynx. Yeah. Realistically, you could be talking as far back as the 12th century, 8th century. Now, the country is beyond recognition, even going back 300 years. Pre-industrial revolution is a big difference to today. But going back pre-Norman, you're going back to a completely different world that has no longer existed. We may have remains of creatures in places, but there's definitely no like ecological gap for them. It's not like the space has just been left a few years ago. It's literally 1,000 years ago, and the landscape has changed. Say even in the north of Scotland, where you see forests, the forests are commercial forests, be different to the kind of forests that some of these creatures are being. So there's a lot more planning needed there, and certainly it's not as simple as just dumping a big predator in the wild and giving it a few instructions and a few pictures of what to eat. Now, I'll be looking at reports of mystery creatures that have washed up on Scotland's shores for roughly the last 1,000 years. And we started with a picture of a Pictish symbol stone. And this shows the mysterious sea beast, or Pictish beast. So far, there are no ideas what this creature is. Some have said it looks vaguely like a dolphin. Some have even identified it as a squid. But it gives you an indication that when we're looking into history of reports, just how difficult it is to identify a creature just from an historic carving or even from the old literature. One of the earliest reports of a Scottish sea creature was from around 900, when a creature described as a large woman washed up on the shore. And that is as good as the description goes. And even today, there is no idea whether that was a large whale, a large squid, or perhaps fantasy. We'll never know. So we start off with the kind of dark ages of sea creatures. But the next time the sea creature washes up is the Stronsay Monster. And during a storm, I think it was 1808, a 55-foot-long creature washes up on this bay in Orkney, on the Isle of Stronsay. It washed up in a storm, and it was measured at around 55 foot. It was said to have 6 limbs and looked particularly monstrous. But as you can see from the photo, it's not the best location for the recovery of any kind of creature. And that's a contemporary drawing of the Stronsay Monster. Now, at 55 foot, that's long. That's far longer than any creature known to wash up on the country, except for some of the larger whales. You can see from the picture, not the clearest, but it has its 6 legs, a tiny head, a long, slender body, and a long, wavy tail. Now, this ties in to sightings at the time of the sea monsters. Now, around the same time, there was a creature described as a large, long sea serpent chased a boat off the island of Coll on the west coast of Scotland. And that was within a year of this. So there were certainly reports of a long, sinuous creature that could be seen swimming along. This is a rather charming artistic impression of the Stronsay Monster by myself, and just showing the scale of the creature compared to a person. And it is absolutely massive, and I certainly would not want to be downwind of that on a warm day. It would have stunk. Luckily, however, it washed across in the age of reason, so people started to pay attention. And they collected some remains. And these are part of the backbone of the Stronsay Monster. They were collected and taken to Edinburgh Museum, where they, I believe, had a label on them saying sea serpent. Since then, they have looked at it and decided that rather than it being a sea serpent, it is the remains of a very large basking shark. Not only did they manage to keep hold of the bones of it, they also collected a few other parts. These, I believe in the Museum of Scotland, a portion of the bone and bristle of a sea snake found off Orkney in 1808. And these were in the Byron collection. Now, there has been an attempt to get the DNA tested of the Stronsay Monster. This was in the early 2000s. And despite numerous attempts, any request was turned down. The reasoning given was that the bones that had been preserved in the jar, the chemicals used would have destroyed the DNA. The drawback with these items is that they are used with schools, and at some point people have touched them. And it is thought that people touching them has led to the DNA being corrupted with so many different people on it, they're not prepared to test it. And basically, there was a scientist interested in testing it, and they were told because of the contamination, there was no point even trying. But they are quite convinced it was a very large basking shark. The skull, and it says paws, were collected, and these went off to, I believe, London. And the reason we only have drawings is because they were destroyed by a German bomb during the Second World War. And that was the end of 2 pieces of the remaining Stronsay Monster. When a basking shark starts to rot, various parts of it fall off, giving it this strange look. And it is thought that a very large basking shark, and to give you an idea how large it is around 15 foot larger than the biggest known basking shark ever found anywhere else. So it was a truly massive creature, if we are to take the measurements correct. But with so few parts of it left now, it's difficult to judge how long the creature would have been. The next one we're looking at is Scalloway in Shetland. So just a couple of years after the Stronsay Monster washes ashore, a large creature washed into that bay. Now, it's fair to say the large terminal wasn't there when it washed up, and it was more of a small village. This creature was at least, I'll just double check my figures. It was we say possibly up to half a mile long. But nobody went out to look at it because they were scared. So it drifted towards the shore and then drifted back out the next day, and nobody actually went to look at it. But that was from 1810, so it's only a couple of years after the start of the scientific look at the Stronsay Monster that people were still scared of strange things washing up. Our next sighting takes us to the island of Benbecula, and this is where a mermaid was washed ashore. And the Mermaid of Benbecula was in 1830. And during the 1830s, a group of people noticed a small aquatic woman swimming alongside the shore and playfully in the waves. A bit later on, for some reason best known to themselves, a group of children started throwing stones at it, to a point where they managed to kill it. And the mermaid washed ashore. They then described this as looking like a small child with a fishy tail, and was buried in the local church. And there have been attempts to recover the remains of this mermaid from the churchyard. However, for some reason, they forgot to put a tombstone where she was. So there's been numerous attempts to search for it over the years, and so far nobody has recovered this mermaid. As far as I know, it is the only mermaid to have washed up dead on any British shore. And as you can tell from this picture, this isn't a mermaid, but this is a 40-foot silo that washed ashore on the same beach, which just goes to show that when a beach gets stuff washed on it, it has a tendency to keep getting stuff washed on it. That was a few years ago. This is a remains of a tree covered in barnacles. During around the 1870s, a tree like this was found in a fishing net and taken to the Isle of Man, where it was displayed, and people actually went to pay money to see the tree that looked like a sea serpent. Whether you'd get money for it today, I'm not sure, but it certainly showed there was an interest in sea serpent remains back then. And you can tell people are a bit desperate to believe. Our next place we're looking at was a report of a sea serpent in Oban. And I will just get the years for it. 1877. According to some newspaper reports, in 1877, a large 60-foot long sea serpent sailed into the Bay of Oban, where the local militia took part in a 5-hour battle with it, shooting all kinds of guns and small cannons at it until they eventually slew the beast. And it would certainly sound one of the most impressive of captures of a sea creature. However, it was a hoax. It actually made it into a number of papers at the time as a genuine sighting, only for a week later for it to be a retraction, and it was actually made up by someone. It's a fascinating tale that is very long-winded and actually leads nowhere. But there's a nice peaceful scene of Oban before the creature arrived. This is an example of one of the sea creatures that was washed up, or rather dredged up, by a trawler from Aberdeen. At the time, some people, including Charles Fort, put it in one of his books that this was the remains of some sea monster, giant worm or sea lizard. It's actually the skull of a whale, and it's strange that even at the time there was people who knew what it was, but had decided to ignore the evidence in front of them, possibly just to help paper sales. Now, this is Dunnet Sands, and there are, in the 1930s, a 30-foot long sea monster turned up. And because that's the start of the Loch Ness Monster sightings with the surgeon's photo, there was a lot of interest in the Loch Ness Monster. So obviously, as soon as a creature washes up on a bay, it's described as the Loch Ness Monster on holiday, or Nessie has gone to this bay. And it was reported to have washed up. And since I did this talk a few years later, I actually found a photo of the creature on the beach. And it was described as a long snake-like body with a small head. And there was a photo of a basically coach party who've gone out to look at it. And they're all in the Sunday best, stood next to these bones, laid out perfectly straight. And the head of the creature is propped up with a paint tin. So it's clear that the bones had been rearranged as a long snake-like body, and the sand pushed up around it to give it a better look. And then for some reason, the only thing to keep its head up was what looked like a large painting. Looking at it, however, it was clear to see that it was actually just a basking shark that had a very, very bad day. The next place we're off to is Orkney. Now, this is Orkney during the 1940s, during the Second World War. And Scapa Flow was a large military naval base. Now, during the first half of the century, there had been a number of sightings of sea creatures around Orkney, including some close encounters with large, multi-flippered, long-necked creatures that had been spotted in some of the bays. So in the 1940s, when these remains start washing up, we start to see these creatures. I think this is the one at Deepdale. And you can see from the image, and there are only a very few descriptions of it and a few basic drawings. But again, it gives the impression of that long-necked classic sea serpent with a hint of a fin further down the body. But it's clear there's quite a lot missing. This is another one, again washed up, and this is after a drawing by Provost Marwick, and it shows this strange creature. Again, a small head, a long neck, strange flippers. Now, this does look like the shape of a rotting basking shark, a well-rotting basking shark, but it also has that look of a sea creature, so it's a pseudo sea serpent. And that is the actual photo of the same thing. So this is one of the sea creatures. Now, that's a basking shark. A lot of it's been floating around for a long time. There was some suggestion that one of these basking sharks may have been hit by some kind of mine or ran into a mine in the water, hence the state of them. But of course, it is wartime. There's not very much going on. People are finding their own entertainment on the island, and of course, there's a few people on the island who've previously seen sea monsters. So, of course, when they see remains washing up, they have a great interest in them. This is a recreation of another one that turned up. Sadly, I wasn't able to get permission to use the original photo. So here we have a bit of plasticine representing the remains of another one of the creatures that washed up. And again, this is just a head with a long set of bones. And this is very similar to the sighting at Dunnet Sands, where basically all the flesh is gone and there's just a set of bones. And you would have to think that possibly they've been arranged to make them look better for any of the photos. But again, with the Orkney sightings, they turned out to be basking sharks. Our next sighting takes place at Girvan. It's in the 1940s. Now, this turns up in one of Arthur C. Clarke's TV shows. And it was on, I think it was Lake of Sea Monsters. And during it, a bloke by the name of, I think it was Charles Rankin, produces a picture of a creature that washed up in the 1940s. Now, the area it was, again, was a naval site. So there were very, very few photos of the area at all in the 1940s, let alone any photos of this creature. Now, if you described it, when it was cut open, it had a piece of, I think it was a tablecloth inside its stomach. And it looked very much like the prehistoric plesiosaur. They took a few samples of it. There was a strand of fibrous material. The rest of it was taken to the local incinerator. The local incinerator then burnt all the remains. And today, that heavily polluted ground is a primary school, which just goes to show that you can build anything on top of a sea serpent. However, a German cryptozoologist by the name of Marcus Hemmler managed to find another report of this sighting from the actual time. Rather than it being a plesiosaur, it actually said that a dead basking shark had washed up, giving the measurements of around 22 foot. And this leads to one of the things I've discovered while looking at these creatures, or these reports of creatures. Far too many times the mundane is being described as exceptional. This being a good example of that. Because again, people have been trying to find the remains at the incinerator. This is closer to what the remains are actually said to look like, or going off his version of what washed up. And next beach looks really nice, and I'm not sure where it is, but I'm going to say it is Troon. Or it might be, I think this one was where another plesiosaur was said to have washed up. This only comes from one sighting in around 1944. It was reported to me by an American cryptozoologist. Sadly, there are very few details of it other than a large plesiosaur washed up on a beach. It had diamond-shaped fins, and the next day it was either washed back out to sea or buried in the sand. And that happened in 1944, and the details only appeared in the late 1990s. So the chances of finding anything of that are long gone. This is an example of what was supposed to have washed up on that beach. But again, so many years have gone before we were even told it existed. Over 50 years. There's no way of finding out what that was. Like I say, it's either gone back out to sea or rotted away. This is the Troon sea monster. And this washed ashore, I think, in the 1950s. And there was an attempt to destroy the remains by pouring fuel over it to burn it. It didn't work, but made it a lot more monstrous looking. Now, according to some reports, up to 5,000 people came to have a look at it. This was probably in the days when there was very few channels on TV and not much to do in Scotland. And they went to look at this. But again, even with this photo, you can see the structure of it being very much that of a basking shark. This is the island of Barra in the 1960s. And we have what looks like a long-necked sea creature washed up on the beach. And this was identified as a whale, a small whale that had washed up. But again, with it being on the island of Barra, being at the bottom end of the Outer Hebrides, not many people got to see it before it's washed out. And certainly that led to the idea that it was different. Again, it could have been a sea monster that washed ashore, especially as a lot of these photos are easy to find these days. That searching online were a lot more difficult to find pre-internet, shall we say, where people would not necessarily have gone off to look at these or for these. This is a dead seal, and for some bizarre reason in the 1970s, for a prank, a dead seal was to be dumped in Loch Ness to give the impression of the Loch Ness Monster, and this was intercepted on its way. And that was the van when it was stopped on its way up to release the dead seal. It was, I believe, taken from Flamingo Land. This is another classic globster. A globster being a odd-shaped creature that's washed up. This one turns up on the Outer Hebrides island of Benbecula, and I believe the photos were in the mid-1990s. It didn't appear until a number of years after it was taken, and it shows the classic globster, this strange kind of creature. Globsters are believed to be the remains of whales, where parts of the flesh have dropped off the bone and then float ashore. This washed up on a bay in Benbecula and then would have washed back out to sea. And you're just lucky enough to have somebody taking a photo of it. When I was living out on the Outer Hebrides, I can remember a large skate washing up on one of the beaches, and you did not want to be downwind of that. The stench was unbelievable. So I can only suggest that she sat upwind of that creature. These are some of the remains of the Loch Ness Monster that have been reported to wash up. We have supposedly one of the Loch Ness Monster teeth. This is actually a deer's antler. We have some fossilized vertebrae of a plesiosaur that were found at the side of the loch. These do not match the local area and certainly are not the remains of a Loch Ness Monster. We have some poor eel that was dumped at the side of the loch as well. Again, no remains of the Loch Ness Monster have actually been recovered so far. This is from 2012 and is the last of the sea serpents up to the date was published, and this was in Aberdeenshire. And as I may have mentioned earlier on, some of these creatures were easily identifiable, and then they were dumped in. The photos are taken of them, and the paper says he's some kind of monster, despite the evidence suggesting they were not. It would be no surprise to know this was in the Daily Mail. And again, it turned out to be, I believe this was a basking shark. And that's the end of the talk.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I didn't actually realise that there were so many supposed sightings of these creatures, especially in the Scotland area, very condensed. I didn't realise that there were so many. And thank you for enlightening me and the rest of the listeners to the amount that is out there. Given its folklore that's obviously started from quite some time ago, do you think it's a little bit more jumping on the bandwagon for sensationalizing this folklore to try to keep it current? Or do you think it's trying to claim that they've found the secrets of the hidden lynx?
The interesting thing about any of those sightings is you get the impression from the very first days it was an in-joke. It was kind of, here's a sea serpent, but we know it's not. And you can see that from the earliest sightings all the way up to the most modern sightings.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the mystery of what's there, but there's no real scientific proof of it. A few years ago, and this was during lockdown, the remains of a creature washed up on Ainsdale Beach in Merseyside. And it was clear, there was two photos of it. One photo showed a monster. It was a jumble of bones, a long neck. And on the opposite side, it was clear it was tiny, and it was actually a dead baleen whale. Now, I was asked if I would go on some TV show, and it was during lockdown, and they wanted me to go out to Ainsdale Beach and basically stand where the remains had been washed up and say, oh, this is a mystery creature. And I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. I couldn't knowingly go to a beach and say, I don't know what this creature is, when it was clearly a whale.
Mm.
And this is the problem, and I think this was one of the things that I discovered while writing the book. I became very cynical about sea serpents and the reports. That time and time again, instead of identifying the creature, there's been a tendency to keep the myth going, to keep the story going. There are still people who maintain that the Stronsay Monster was a plesiosaur. Even the fact that plesiosaurs didn't have 6 limbs, they still want to do it. And you can still see things on TV, even new shows saying it was a monster. And yet it was cleared up, I think, about the 1820s. They decided it wasn't a monster. And things moved on. But I think it's because, again, it's the sea. And you've got this wide open space. It's got all that mystery in it. As for the examples in the talk, I think that's only a third of all the sightings.
Okay. It's interesting. But you see, along with the areas that you specifically brought to us this evening, and most of them are up in Scotland, they are quite remote in that area. Do you think that they want to keep this folklore continuing with all the interest to bring in money and public to come and to have a look and see if they can find the mystery that was reported all those years ago?
I think tourism has moved on from these things. So you're more likely now to get people going whale watching.
Okay.
Whale watching is much more interesting than looking for something from washed up. Near Dunnet Sands, towards the head top and the Cave Ness, they're going to recreate and rebuild a Pictish rock tower. And they've identified locally that as the best tourist attraction. So they're going to recreate a Dark Age 30-foot long, tall stone tower. That's going to be rebuilt to bring people in to look at that. And that's got a much greater pull than any of these sightings. And whale watching, certainly, seal watching. There's actually plenty of nature that the majority of people don't see. If you're not from a coastal community, you will not see a whale or a dolphin. You'll not see seals. You know, and that alone is enough of attraction to get people in. In many ways, the sea serpent is dying a death. There's a lack of interest in it. And there's a number of reasons. The number of sightings have dropped. Now, there's many reasons why the number of sightings of say, sea creatures, sea monsters have dropped. One, it's the difference in commerce. The sailing ships have gone, the slower, quieter ships have gone. The bigger ships stick to set paths. There's the idea of pollution or the lack of food. There's a number of different reasons, but I do think, in many ways, the sea serpent is literally going extinct. Not because of any other reason, but just due to a lack of interest.
It is a shame in some ways because, you know, it's things that's brought tourists and industry flocking to people's, you know, into their small remote villages and their towns for so many years. And I think there is still a part of humanity that likes to keep the unknown and the folklore going. So it's a shame that these things, you know, are proved to not be true, not be factual for some people. So yes, I understand totally what you're saying, that, you know, that these have moved on and people aren't reporting them anymore. Apart from Loch Ness, that still seems to have kept its interest with people. As for it being whales and basking sharks, for example, that seem to be behind the other carcasses that's washed up on the shore, could this actually be a possibility for Loch Ness? Because from what I can understand, it's a closed access for waterway, or are there subsidiaries that run out into the sea?
I will have to be honest and say I'm very, very sceptical about Loch Ness. The weird thing about Loch Ness, and it goes back, I think it was either 1840s or 1860s. There was actually a ship dumped. I think it was a skinned carcass of a small whale in Loch Ness. And it's a strange kind of practical joke whether we're dumping a monster in the loch. There seems to be stories of a monster in Loch Ness going back a couple of 100 years. There's certainly this example of the dumping the remains in there suggests that there was certainly folklore in, say, the 1860s of there being a monster and throwing something in to make it look like one. The trouble with the Loch Ness monster is it fails to keep the same shape. Now, the easiest way to look at it is, if I said to you what a horse looked like, you would know.
Yeah.
If the next time I saw a horse I described as sheep, you would think, well, that's not the same thing.
Mm.
If the next time I described a giraffe, you would know it's not the same thing. And then an elephant, and then a whale. Now, when people describe the Loch Ness Monster, the descriptions vary that kind of difference between all those things. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's big, sometimes it's got a long neck, sometimes it's got a short neck, sometimes it's fast, sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's huge, sometimes it's... They're not adult and juvenile, they're different things.
Mm.
And I say, it's my personal belief there's absolutely nothing in there. Absolutely nothing to be found. Rather, it is a number of different sightings. It is possible for seals to get in from down the River Ness.
Yeah.
It's even possible to get theoretically a dolphin into the... There's the idea of giant eels. Again, it is possible, but it doesn't account for all the sightings. If anything, writing this book destroyed my belief in any kind of aquatic monster, I'm afraid. When you look at 1,000 years of sightings and you find not a single one of them stands up to any kind of test, it kind of makes you a bit cynical.
It's the same in anything paranormal or anomalous, I guess, that the more that you investigate and the more that you research things, you do become more cynical over the years. I myself have found that within the paranormal for ghosts. So, yeah, I think, and as science and improvements continue to get better, obviously we have more things that we can question, and we've got more things that we can find answers for, and more things that we can dismiss. So what was once this, amazing folklore of these sea creatures, obviously they've been disproved by science and improvements in technology, I'm guessing.
Yeah, there's... I think it's because there was only a finite number of sightings. Once you can go through each stranding, shall we say, it becomes very easy to identify. Certainly anything from the age of photography onwards becomes very easy to identify, even where before photography, when the remains were just properly stored, it becomes easy to find. With stories of sightings of sea monsters, again, the mystery's still there. There are reports of sightings of creatures off Orkney that are very interesting and very hard to decide what they are. Certainly, a number of long-necked creatures have appeared. But even then, they're getting up to 100 years ago now. They've not continued to appear. And this is... It's like the golden age of the sea serpents has died. But whether that is because whatever the sea serpent has literally died off, we'll never know. I mean, back at the peak of sea serpent sightings, there were vast shoals of herring being fished out all across the North Sea. The fish stocks have collapsed. For all we know, they could have been eating that, and they've become extinct before we even knew.
Yeah.
We can't say for certain these creatures didn't exist 100 years ago, but for all we know, they were the tail end. They were the last of the great sea beasts. And I say they could have died out, starved to death before anybody really noticed they existed. But if you go back another 100 years before, there's a suspicion that the sea serpent is just one creature. So it turns up around the oceans. It's just one creature that just happens to appear everywhere, wave and go off. So I suppose it goes in a fashion, but now that, like I say, technology and information's a lot easier to find the answers, it kind of takes away the mystery. It's time to look for something. And I've also noticed within cryptozoology in general, there's been a move from the flesh and blood to the fantastical. The Bigfoot of Britain, or the winged humanoids, the creatures that never existed and then suddenly have sprung into life as if taking the place. Like we've got this need to have these creatures of mystery, whether these sea creatures or phantom creatures in the local woods. We keep creating them and just give them somewhere new. Certainly, if you're looking for mystery creatures and you can't get to the beach, why not invent one in your local woods that just happens to be a Bigfoot?
Yeah, I totally agree. So, are there any aquatic creatures that could account in Loch Ness that are big enough? Do they have kelpies and things there?
The Loch Ness monster. It's difficult because sightings have taken place over so many years. They come literally as the fashion of the time. So you've got the surgeon's photo with the long neck, possibly balanced on a toy submarine. That led to the long-necked Loch Ness monster. As far as the 1970s, people were seeing the long-necked monster. So they were seeing a tall neck towering out of the water. And yet, it's almost like it was a swimming giraffe. It's got this really long neck on the body. And a lot of that was based on the idea of a plesiosaur. Plesiosaur remains show a long neck, small head and a long neck onto a body. And it was thought, depictions of plesiosaur in books at the time showed its neck stuck up into the sky, snapping at birds flying over. As more research has been carried out, it was then discovered that plesiosaur necks literally don't go up, they go side to side. So it sweeps left and right, not up and down. So the idea of it having a neck that could stick out the water disappears. So literally, as knowledge improves, the features that a lot of these sea creatures had and the Loch Ness monster had disappear. With the advent of mobile phones, Loch Ness sightings now are ripples on the water, or lines on the water. And this is the same for Loch Ness. You see these lines. Now, there is no way of judging speed. You're looking at a line in the water, you have no idea if it is a sea creature swimming at 30 miles an hour or a water bird landing. Certainly, some of the sightings of Loch Ness show a seabird or a water bird landing. But it's at such a distance, the mobile phone's only catching the splashes and the line in the water and missing the bird at the front. There are other things shown as reflections. There are the humps that appear, the strange humps that appear within these lakes. It's difficult to know what they are because sometimes it appears with one hump, two humps, up to 7. But Loch Ness, it's 30 odd miles away from Loch Ness, not as observed, deeper than Loch Ness, and they're still over 12 miles long, and there are not many people along it. They get reports of creatures with humps, but the description of how many humps changes. Sometimes it's 1 or 2, sometimes it's 5 or 6. Now, are these a creature? And it goes back to the earliest sightings of the Scandinavian worm, as it was called, the sinuous, long sea creature that's kind of moved on the surface with its back popping out of the water like a big coil. But if we were to look at sea snakes, they don't move like that. they move side to side like a snake. Nothing really has that movement, that up and down movement. It's side to side. There was some thought that those earliest sea creatures ideas were influenced by the findings of fossilized whale remains, where it just showed this long body, and then they fit. Oh, it must have a long body. It must move up and down, because they forgot it had flippers. They forgot it had a tail. The bit they've got, they think, "Oh, we'll make it," and it's like those early dinosaur statues, sculptures. Can't remember where they are, but they basically put them together based on what they had, and they're nothing like the creature. But when you've got a bunch of spare parts, just put them to what you think you're going to look like, and that's trouble. And I think with things like Loch Ness, that's been the problem. It changes with fashions, it changes with times. Like I say, the latest wave of sightings are now things that are good for being captured on your phone. It's less you are capturing a real creature, it's more you're capturing something anomalous on your phone. But then again, your phone isn't a state-of-the-art recording device. It's a phone with a camera. It's not designed to spot things at night. It's not designed to follow something at 2 miles away. It's designed to take a couple of selfies and, maybe picture of a squirrel eating a nut. It's not designed for much more than that. So there's still plenty of, like I say, plenty of mystery of what these things could be. There's certainly a number of creatures known to science that could be in those lochs.